morning, everybody. So far, so good. I didn't trip or anything. The Networks conferences are always like a homecoming, and I always enjoy them. I know so many people here from over the years, and it's the opportunity to get to know others. So the last segment of the morning plenary, we're going to tell stories. I'm going to tell one, and then Jamal and Enrique are going to tell two. David Assay, who is the founder and president and last year's keynote speaker, he's the founder and president of StoryCorps, told us many reasons why sharing our stories are important. They break down barriers, they bring us closer together, and it's a way of our collective experiences of understanding our world better. My story begins a few years out of graduate school. I had gotten a job at the Columbia University School of Social Work, which had gotten a grant from the then New York State Department of Social Services to develop training material about the needs of single disenfranchised people. At the time, there was limited knowledge about impoverished single people. And my job was to develop a field initiative to get the project going. So in 1981, where do you go to find disenfranchised single people? Today, you would go to the shelter system, but back then, you would go to single-room occupancy hotels, or SROs, which were privately owned buildings with shared kitchens and bathrooms. Though you would be not too keen on getting into one of the grubby tubs or spending much time in the rodent-infested kitchens. They had very small living areas, and I wound up spending a lot of time in SRO hotels. In general, SROs were housing of last resort for thousands of people on fixed and small incomes. They included thousands of people discharged from state psychiatric hospitals, so there was really not much in the community in the way of services. People had to be self-reliant or dependent upon the kindness of others or isolated, and many were. Nationwide, it is approximated that 250,000, or 50% of the SRO housing stock, was lost during the 1970s and 80s. There were about 125,000 SRO units in New York City in the early 70s, and that number eroded by about 100,000 into the 1980s. In large measure, they were lost to gentrification and were converted to larger apartments and condos. It was the demise of these hotels and the massive illegal evictions that took place that contributed significantly to the introduction of wide-scale homelessness. Those of us working with SRO tenants and former SRO tenants shared a passion to see the individuals to get SRO tenants and former SRO tenants to get quality housing and access to quality support services. Project Fine, St. Francis Friends of the Poor, and Westside Federation for Senior Housing are examples of organizations that led grassroots housing efforts to preserve yet recreate and perfect the SRO. We wanted to create quality housing and support services for those who needed them, but we wanted to preserve what we saw in those SROs: the freedom to come and go, services being a matter of individual choice, an integrated and varied tenancy, and clear tenants' rights. Leases. By 1983, CUCS, which was then Columbia University Community Services, teamed up with Broadway Housing to develop the Heights in northern Manhattan, a 55-unit building with shared kitchens and baths. 15 units were reserved for homeless people with mental illness and the balance for other homeless people. Almost everyone was recruited from the 178th Street bus station and the street. When we fully rented up the first time, we had several serious drug dealers, active sex workers, and 20-plus people with mental illness. It was kind of a hippie model. So it wasn't quite perfect, but the will was there. It was a new experience for everyone involved. Ellen Baxter, the executive director of Broadway Housing, worked with HPD, and I worked with DMH, which funded 3 direct service staff, with the understanding that they would provide services to anyone who asked for it, and that's what we asked for. CUCS would go on to do more supportive housing, of course, with Broadway Housing, and then do some really great and dial-turning projects with Common Ground, now Breaking Ground. But those early years were formative for me, and in one way or another, for most everyone in this room who has anything to do with supportive housing. By and large, we collectively still hold to the principles of that era and try to perfect the experience for our tenants. Fortunately, we've moved away from shared kitchens and baths. We learned early on that nobody likes to go down the hallway in their underwear. So, there were several experiences, some incidental, that eventually led me to expand my interest in single individuals to families. When my oldest son was about 3, a tenant at the Heights named Mary began to take care of him sometimes. I was there one day, probably around 1992, with Commissioner Searles from the State Office of Mental Health, who had asked me for a tour. You can appreciate the commissioners and my surprise when the social worker leading the tour, the program director, knocked on Mary's door to show the unit, and the door opened and we heard aloud, "Dad!" That program director is actually here, Sue Smith from Project Home. Sometimes Mary would take my son to the zoo or the park or stay with him in the community room at the Heights. It seemed very natural and nice, and both Ellen and I were so impressed by how the presence of just one kid could enliven the community room and bring out smiles, stories, and the best in people. Some years later, I was giving a tour of government officials of CUCS's shelter for homeless single mentally ill women. There were about 20 women sitting at the table. After introductions and some conversation, one person on the tour asked, "How many of you have children?" It took me by surprise. Half the women in the room raised their hands. He asked those who were willing to answer, "Where are they? What happened?" Some said foster care, some said living with grandparents, some said the court took them away, others lost them when they went to Rikers. In this day and age, it seems unnecessary, if not primitive, to separate a child and mother due to mental illness and the problems it can cause. Today, CUCS prefers to develop supportive housing that is inclusive of both families and singles because supportive housing can do it. It feels more natural to us at CUCS, and family supportive housing is so sorely needed. For people who are in need of ongoing support, one of the great treasures about supportive housing is that supportive housing is there for them for a lifetime. It's been great for me too, frankly. From time to time, I still see tenants from the Heights and from our other supportive housing sites. I have known some for many years, even before they entered supportive housing from the shelter and street. It was very touching when my son reunited with Mary last year at a Broadway Housing fundraiser. These are the things that make us whole. Thank you for listening. So it's my pleasure. I want to, so I want to introduce both speakers, and then we're going to bring up one. So it's Jamar Daniels, who's connected to the Christopher, of course. I'm sorry. Yeah, so it's Jamar and Enrique. They'll introduce themselves. Jamar is connected to the Jewish Board. Sorry, got that wrong. And Enrique is connected to the Christopher, which is a Breaking Ground CUCS operation. And when Enrique comes up, we're also going to have Casey Donahue's been working with him come up. So let me start with Jamar Daniels.